Picture this. You're a Roman senator. You've spent the morning rehearsing your words, trimming your toga, practicing the exact angle of your bow, because today you've been summoned to dine with the most powerful man in the world. You should be honored, grateful even, but your hands are sweating, your heart is racing, because this man, this god emperor you're about to face, has murdered men for blinking at the wrong moment. He's laughed while families were torn apart for his amusement, and tonight, you're sitting at his table. As you enter the dining hall, it's not the gold or the marble that catches your eye. It's the horse. Yes, the horse. Draped in purple cloth and adorned with pearls, it stands beside the emperor's throne. A slave offers it fruit from a silver tray. Another fans it gently with ostrich feathers. And when you take your seat, you're instructed to toast the animal. Because this is Incitatus, and tomorrow he will be named a senator of Rome. And the worst part? That's not even close to the most disturbing thing Caligula ever did. To understand how Rome ended up here, a piazza bowing before a horse and pretending it made sense, we have to go back, not to Caligula's reign, but to the bloody poisoned roots of his life. He was born Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, named after his famous father, a beloved general who was seen as the future of Rome. His mother, Agrippina the Elder, was the granddaughter of Augustus himself. Young Gaius had the pedigree of a god, and he was adored by the legions. As a child, they dressed him in tiny armor and boots, calling him Caligula, or Little Boots. It was a joke, a term of affection. No one was laughing later, because the boy they once coddled grew up to become one of the most terrifying men history has ever recorded. And the transformation didn't happen in peace. It happened under the most twisted mentorship imaginable. The Emperor Tiberius, after his father died, likely poisoned by political enemies, Caligula's family fell from grace. His mother was exiled, 2 of his brothers were imprisoned and starved to death. But Caligula? He was summoned to live with Tiberius, who by then had abandoned Rome for the island of Capri. Capri was paradise on the surface. Villas overlooking turquoise seas, marble statues, lush gardens, endless banquets. But behind the walls, it was a place of nightmares. Tiberius, once a soldier statesman, had become a recluse and a predator. Ancient sources describe him keeping a coterie of abused boys, conducting sadistic rituals, and executing guests who displeased him, throwing them off cliffs into the sea. His paranoia was legendary. He trusted no one. And into this world of cruelty and silence walked teenage Caligula. He learned quickly. He kept quiet. He watched. He didn't mourn out loud when his mother died in exile or when his brothers vanished from their cells. He survived by smiling, by nodding, by pretending not to feel. By the time Tiberius died, or was murdered as some claimed, Caligula was the last one standing, and he knew it. When he returned to Rome and was named emperor in 37 AD, the city erupted in joy. The people adored him. He was young, handsome, the son of Germanicus, the promise of a brighter future. He gave bonuses to the guards, pardoned prisoners, hosted games and feasts. The Senate sang his praises. The streets were filled with chants of, "Hail Caesar!" For a moment it felt like the dawn of a golden age. But it didn't last. Within a year, Caligula fell violently ill. Some said it was poison, others whispered it was a curse. Whatever it was, he hovered near death for weeks. Rome held its breath. And when he recovered, something had changed. The man who emerged from that sick bed was not the same smiling youth they had cheered for. He was colder now, more distant, more theatrical. He laughed too hard, grew angry too fast. He stared at people just a little too long, and his jokes began to cut deeper, more brutal, less human. At first they said he was eccentric. Then they called him mad. He began executing senators for minor offenses, or no offenses at all. He told the court he wanted Rome to remember what true fear felt like. He summoned men to dinner and had them stabbed between courses. He stared into their eyes as they died, and then raised a toast. He told others he could have them strangled on a whim, and no one would stop him. He wasn't wrong, because by then, he wasn't just the emperor. He was a god, or at least that's what he began to claim. He ordered temples built in his honor. Statues of Jupiter were altered to resemble him. He walked through the forum dressed as Apollo, as Mercury, as Mars. Sometimes he would arrive in the Senate chamber in full armor and demand that senators kneel, not to him as ruler, but to him as a deity. He declared that the gods themselves were jealous of him, that the ocean bowed to him, that he could speak to the moon and rearrange the stars. The Senate, spineless and afraid, played along. They praised his divinity, wrote poems in his honor. One senator wept as he called Caligula the dawn-bringer, the flame of Olympus, the thunder of Rome. Caligula gave him a gift, then had him executed for insincerity. But for all of his divine claims, all the cruelty and chaos, nothing shook Rome like what came next. Because in the middle of all this madness, Caligula began pouring imperial funds into a strange new project. A stable, a palace-sized stable, built from marble, lined with silk, staffed with servants, decorated with ivory troughs and golden feed buckets. It was for his horse, Incitatus. And when Rome asked why, Caligula gave them the answer with a smile. He is to be senator. At first they thought it was a joke, a sick private joke between the emperor and himself. When Caligula began lavishing his horse with gifts, not just apples or garlands, but a villa, a staff, and custom-made furniture, Rome didn't know whether to laugh or tremble. The horse, Incitatus, slept on cushions dyed imperial purple. He drank from goblets crafted by the same goldsmiths who served the Senate. His name appeared on guest lists before consuls. And his stable? Soundproofed, to protect his sleep from common noise. The aristocracy whispered that Caligula had lost his mind, but the smarter ones knew better. He hadn't lost it. He was weaponizing it, because the moment Caligula publicly declared that Incitatus would be made senator, it became clear this wasn't insanity. This was humiliation as politics. To understand the horror of that act, you have to understand the Senate. It was once the most powerful institution in Rome, the body that guided emperors, shaped laws, defended tradition. Men killed for seats in the Senate. They bled on battlefields for a chance to be heard in that chamber. But under Caligula, they bowed to a horse. He would lead Incitatus to formal events, draped in jewels and silks, and seat him beside Rome's most senior statesmen. They were told to greet the animal with reverence. When it neighed, some claimed to hear divine approval. Priests even began to wonder aloud if the horse might be blessed by the gods. They knew it was absurd. That wasn't the point. The point was obedience. If Caligula said a horse could govern Rome, then it could. And if you laughed, you might be next. Why did he do it? Some historians say he was mocking the Senate, showing them how little he thought of their role, that any beast could replace them, that they had become so cowardly, so sycophantic, that they'd smile even while being degraded. Others believe it was darker than mockery, that Caligula genuinely saw Incitatus as purer, more noble, more deserving of power than the corrupt, trembling men who surrounded him. A horse wouldn't betray him. A horse wouldn't whisper treason. A horse wouldn't look away when he declared himself a god. There's even the suggestion that, in his twisted mind, the horse was a reflection of himself. A silent creature worshipped, fed, pampered, feared. But maybe the truth is even simpler. Maybe Caligula was testing how far reality could stretch before it snapped, and Rome was bending. By now, statues of Caligula had replaced those of Mars and Jupiter. Coins bore his image as a sun god. Children were taught that he controlled the moon, and public ceremonies had transformed into bizarre performances. Senators crawling on the floor, priests offering wine to statues of Caligula, slaves chanting his name in rhythms that imitated divine hymns. Even the most sacred traditions became tools in his theater. He declared himself the high priest of Jupiter, then entered the temple, beheaded the statue, and replaced its face with his own. The priests choked back their outrage. The people crossed themselves in fear. He ordered temples to Diana, Apollo, even Isis to carry his image on their altars. When a group of priests hesitated, he had their tongues cut out. They were later seen in public, still performing the rituals, bleeding silently. Rome was no longer ruled by laws or logic. It was ruled by a story, a myth, a waking dream narrated by a madman, and everyone else was a character in it. Then came the war with the sea. One morning, without warning, Caligula assembled thousands of troops along the coast. He wore armor of silver and silk. The generals thought it was an invasion, a campaign into Britannia. Morale soared. Soldiers chanted his name. But when they reached the shoreline, Caligula ordered them to attack the ocean. They lined up, raised their spears, and charged the waves. No enemy appeared. There was no battle. Just the sound of Roman sandals splashing into surf. After several hours of meaningless combat, Caligula declared victory. He ordered his men to collect seashells, calling them spoils from Neptune. He had a triumph in Rome, parading through the streets with chariots full of shells, and once again, no one dared to question it. What makes this terrifying is not just what Caligula did, but what he proved. That reality could be broken, that if a lie was big enough, bizarre enough, and enforced by enough fear, it would become law. A horse could be a senator, a madman could be a god, a wave could be an enemy, and the people would cheer, salute, and pray, because the alternative, resisting, meant death. Imagine this. You're a senator's wife. You've been invited to a private dinner at the imperial palace. A rare honor. The invitation came sealed with gold thread. Your husband tells you to smile, to say nothing unnecessary, and most of all, never speak unless spoken to. When you arrive, the table is set like something out of Olympus. Platters of roasted peacock, goblets overflowing with dark wine, musicians playing in the shadows. But all the beauty fades the moment he enters. Caligula, draped in white and gold, his eyes scanning the room like a predator. His voice soft, pleasant, too pleasant. You know that tone by now. It's the one he uses before something dies. He walks past your husband and stops in front of you. He looks you over and, slowly, then turns to your husband and says casually, "I'll be borrowing your wife tonight." And just like that, you're his. These weren't isolated acts. Caligula used intimacy as another extension of domination. He slept with senators' wives, sometimes in front of them. Other times he brought the women back the next day and gave graphic reviews of their performance, laughing as the men tried to hide their shame. But this wasn't about lust. It was about humiliation. He broke people by touching what they loved, then forcing them to thank him for it. He demanded not only their obedience, but their gratitude. He wanted them not just to suffer, but to smile through it. He built what some historians now call the pleasure palace, an annex within the imperial grounds, decorated in flowers, silk, and gold leaf. But beneath the surface, it was a factory of terror. High-ranking women were brought in, dressed in goddess costumes, and forced to dance or serve wine while Caligula watched from behind a curtain. Some were made to crawl. Others were tied with garlands and told to sing prayers. Those who cried too much were punished. Those who smiled too little, executed. He took the temple priestesses of Vesta, sworn as virgins of sacred fire, and turned them into his private entertainment. The most sacred women in Rome, used as objects in games of power. And he didn't stop there. Caligula held dinners of death. Guests were summoned in the evening, unaware they'd been marked. They ate beside Caligula under candlelight, made jokes, drank wine, even toasted their host. Then after the meal they were escorted quietly into side chambers and strangled. Sometimes their heads were sent back to the table as the next course. He said it reminded people to eat with appreciation. Other times he simply walked into a gathering, pointed to a man at random, and said, "Execute him. He's too quiet." No reason, no crime, just a demonstration, because what Caligula really worshipped wasn't love or war or even the gods. It was control. There were stories of men forced to crawl through his garden on all fours, barking like dogs for his amusement, of senators beaten with rods in front of their slaves, of servants sewn into animal skins and torn apart by dogs as part of a performance. And the worst part? People applauded, because to be silent was suspicious. To disapprove was suicidal. Applause became a survival mechanism, a mask to hide the horror. In Rome, no one knew who would vanish next. A friend could disappear at sunset, and by dawn their house would be reassigned, their name removed from records, their portrait burned, their family shamed into silence. Caligula didn't just kill people. He erased them. He would walk through the forum with bodyguards and point to random citizens, asking, "Should I have this one killed?" Sometimes he'd order the execution on the spot. Other times he'd smile and say, "Spare, for now." It became a city-wide ritual. Whenever Caligula passed, people froze in place, hoping their stillness would save them. No one waved, no one called out. They just prayed to remain invisible. And then, amid all this terror, came another public announcement. Incitatus, the emperor's horse, would not only be named senator, he would be made consul, the highest office in the Roman Republic. On the day Caligula officially named Incitatus consul, the Senate chamber was silent. Not with protest, not with disbelief, but with fear. Men who once gave fiery speeches about honor and tradition now sat still in polished togas, sweat dripping down their backs, watching a horse clop across marble tiles. He was draped in purple, the imperial color. A golden wreath circled his brow. 2 slaves fanned his flanks, while another held a scroll as if awaiting his vote. No one laughed, because in Caligula's Rome, the moment you stopped playing along was the moment you stopped breathing. Let's be clear, the title of consul was not ceremonial. It was, in theory, the highest office in the Republic. Even under the emperors, the position retained a symbolic authority, representing centuries of Roman legal tradition, military power, and civic virtue. And now, that title belonged to a horse. But the horror wasn't just in the act. It was in what it meant. Because this wasn't Caligula making fun of Rome. It was Caligula rewriting Rome. The senators, some of them descended from like Scipio and Cicero, were forced to debate legislation in the presence of an animal. When Incitatus neighed, courtiers whispered that it was a vote in favor. When he stomped his hoof, they called it a veto. Caligula would sit nearby watching, waiting, smiling. He wasn't laughing at the absurdity. He was drunk on the obedience. And no one dared break the spell. Because this wasn't just mockery. It was a loyalty test. And Rome failed it. The deeper truth? Caligula didn't think Incitatus was intelligent. He didn't think he was divine. He didn't even necessarily believe he was making a statement about the Senate's stupidity. Though he certainly enjoyed that implication. What he believed, what he knew, was that power didn't need to make sense. Power didn't need logic, reason, or justification. Power was. If he said the horse ruled Rome, then it did. And the terrifying thing was, he was right. From this moment on, the line between reality and performance vanished. Caligula had proven something irreversible. Something few tyrants in history have ever demonstrated so purely. That when power is absolute, truth becomes optional. And when truth disappears, madness becomes law. There were no protests, no riots in the streets, no brave senators standing up to decry the insult. Just silence, silence, and the sound of hooves on marble. The next day, new laws were passed, edicts signed, trials held, and Incitatus was listed among the attendees. The official records note his presence. The scribes dared not omit it. Rome was now ruled in part by an animal, and no one did a thing. And yet, something began to shift, because in that silence something cracked. Maybe it was in the heart of a soldier watching the palace guards bow to a stallion. Maybe it was in the eyes of a senator who could no longer look at his own reflection. Maybe it was in the streets, in whispers, in prayers, and tears. But somewhere someone realized, Rome could not survive this much longer. That madness may reign for a while, but it cannot last forever. And behind every empire of fear there is a moment of reckoning. By the start of 41 AD, Caligula was no longer the man who'd been cheered through the streets just 4 years earlier. The once radiant son of Germanicus, the golden hope of Rome, had become something else entirely. Something colder, stranger, hollowed out by power and devoured by paranoia. He still smiled, but it was tight, suspicious. He still performed as a god, but with growing desperation. Because deep down, though he would never admit it, Caligula was afraid. He had seen the look in their eyes. The senators, once groveling, now bowed too quickly, too mechanically. They avoided his gaze. Guards saluted with rehearsed stiffness. Slaves moved silently in the halls. The laughter at his jokes came half a second too late. The prayers offered in his name grew shorter, flatter, less convincing. He wasn't stupid. He understood. The fear was still there, but something else was rising underneath it. Disgust. And worse, contempt. He tried to clamp down harder. Executions increased. Informants were paid double. Entire households disappeared. He demanded oaths of loyalty from the priesthood, forced senators to rename their estates in his honor, and issued a proclamation that all newborn boys be registered with his name added as a second praenomen. He even began reciting his own genealogy as if it were divine scripture, tracing his lineage not just to Augustus, but to Mars, Jupiter, and Venus. But the more he screamed his divinity, the more obvious the truth became. A god shouldn't have to beg to be worshipped. That's when the whispers began to harden into plans. The Senate wouldn't move. Too weak. The people couldn't rise. Too afraid. But the Praetorian Guard? They were close enough. They'd seen enough. And a few of them, led by a quiet, calculating officer named Cassius Chaerea, began to ask the forbidden question. What if we kill him? Cassius had reason to hate. Caligula mocked him daily, called him soft, womanish, a half-man. Once, when Cassius asked for a watchword, Caligula sneered, "Here's your password, Venus." He humiliated him not just in public, but as policy, a personal sport. And now, that man, that soldier, held the key to the emperor's survival, or his death. They planned carefully. The theater would be the place. Caligula had a performance scheduled, an appearance that required him to walk through a narrow corridor behind the stage, a place with no guards, no public, just shadows. Perfect. The conspirators numbered less than 10, mostly Praetorians, a few senators, a freedman or two, not because they trusted one another, but because they shared a common truth. If Caligula lived another year, Rome might not. The morning of the assassination, Caligula awoke late. He had nightmares now. Nightmares of drowning, of choking, of being torn apart by lions. He told his physician the gods were angry, that Jupiter had visited him in sleep, eyes filled with blood. The physician nodded, prescribed more wine, and left quietly, never to be seen again. Caligula arrived at the theater in high spirits, or pretending to be. He wore a white robe embroidered with golden suns, claiming it had been stitched by moonlight. He made jokes. He paused for applause. He recited a poem to the crowd. But as he left the stage, walking into the corridor behind the curtains, no applause followed him. Only footsteps. The corridor behind the theater was dim and narrow, lined with polished stone and echoing silence. Caligula walked slowly, surrounded by a few attendants, humming a tune from the performance he'd just watched. He was in a good mood. That would be the last feeling he ever had. From the shadows, Cassius Chaerea stepped forward. He said nothing, just raised his hand and struck. The blade went deep into Caligula's neck. The emperor staggered backward, arms flailing. He opened his mouth to shout, but blood choked the sound. Another blade appeared, then another. More men joined, each thrusting, slashing, gasping for breath like they were drowning in fear and rage and relief. Caligula didn't die easily. He screamed. He clawed. He tried to run. But the corridor left no room. They stabbed him 30 times. And when he finally collapsed in a pool of his own blood, twitching, eyes wide, mouth still moving in silent protest, the men stood over him in a stunned silence, not cheering, not celebrating, just watching. Because no one, not even a murderer, expects to see a god die. Within hours, Rome changed. The Senate met in emergency session. Some demanded a return to the Republic. Others feared civil war. No one could agree. Meanwhile, Caligula's body lay cooling in a shallow grave on the outskirts of the city, hastily covered in dirt like a dog. No funeral, no honors, no prayers. His wife was murdered. His infant daughter's head was smashed against a wall. The god emperor's bloodline ended before nightfall. And Incitatus, the horse who'd almost ruled Rome, he was never seen again. Some say he was quietly put down, buried in secret to avoid becoming a symbol. Others claim he was sold, stripped of his jewels, reduced to a common beast, forgotten. But perhaps the most haunting version is the simplest. That Incitatus simply stood, waiting at his marble stall, unaware that the world around him had changed forever, waiting for a master who would never return. What did it all mean? Was Caligula truly mad? Or was his madness the natural result of a world that gave one man the power of a god? Maybe the Senate wasn't shocked that he named a horse consul. Maybe they were shocked at how easy it was to obey. Maybe the real horror wasn't Caligula. Maybe it was how long Rome let him reign. And so, his story became legend. A name passed through history as a warning, not just of one man's cruelty, but of what happens when fear replaces truth, when power replaces meaning, when everyone agrees to a lie until they forget it's a lie at all. Caligula died believing he was immortal. The world remembers him as something worse, not just a tyrant, not just a lunatic, but a mirror, a reminder that when civilization abandons its soul, even a horse can wear the crown.